We're going to talk about our strengths. And one of the major reasons why we want to identify our strengths is that actually you and I are far more likely to find our strengths to be a problem to us spiritually than our weaknesses. And that's because of this phrase, which is the real theme for this talk, and that's this: do not let your strength become a weakness. Now I know that sounds a bit like a contradiction. How could a strength become a weakness? But have a look at the scriptural basis for this. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and read with me verse 16, because this scripture shows that it is possible for a strength to become a weakness. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and read with me verse 16. There, verse 16 says, do not become righteous overmuch, nor show yourself excessively wise. Why should you cause desolation to yourself? And would you not agree that if someone was described as righteous, well, we'd normally view that as being a strength. If you've got a love of what's right and what's proper, you always aim to do the thing that is upright, wouldn't you agree that that's a strength? And yet, it says we could become righteous overmuch. Or the second one, wise. Would we not say that having godly wisdom is something else that we would like to have because we would feel it would make us spiritually strong? And yet, the verse says it's possible that we could become excessively wise. And what would it lead to? Well, what does verse 16 say is the result of being overly righteous and excessively wise? It could actually lead to spiritual desolation. And that perhaps highlights the reason why you and I need to identify what our strengths are. Because actually, brothers and sisters, you and I are far more likely to have spiritual problems, to get into spiritual difficulties, perhaps be stumbled by a strength becoming a weakness than by our weaknesses. You and I well know our weaknesses, so we tend to cocoon our weaknesses. We're watching that our weaknesses don't let us down. But wouldn't it be easy to take our strengths for granted? And that could be what sorely tries us spiritually. Just to illustrate this, we're going to look at one event in the life of one man. The man lived in the 8th century BCE, and his name was Azariah. Now Azariah became the king of the southern two-tribe kingdom of Judah, and he reigned for over half a century. During his time there were 6 kings that sat on the northern 10-tribe kingdom of Israel, and he also reigned during the time of 4 major biblical prophets. Now during his early years, Azariah had a mentor, a man by the name of Zechariah. Not the prophet Zechariah, but a man of the same kind of spiritual calibre, who was able to guide and direct and advise him. A little bit like, can you remember back when you first came in the truth, brothers and sisters? That if in the perhaps 2 or 3 years after baptism you had a question or a problem, who might you well go to first to talk it over with? It might well have been the person that you studied with. Because you've got confidence in that brother or sister, and you've got this problem, you might well go to that person, and they're a little bit like a mentor to you. But of course, eventually, you and I have to stand on our own 2 feet, spiritually speaking. So what happened to King Azariah when he stood on his own 2 feet? Well, the result was that he was a spectacular success. Everything he did worked brilliantly. It turns out he was quite a military genius. He was the master tactician. He defeated the Philistines, the Arabians. He pushed back the domination of the northern 10-tribe kingdom of Israel. In fact, he never lost a battle. So when it came to military matters, we could certainly say he really was a success. It wasn't the only thing he undertook. He also undertook major works of construction. He strengthened the fortifications of the capital city, Jerusalem. He refortified strategic cities throughout the land of Judah. But also, he had built cities from a greenfield site to a completed walled city. So, wonderfully successful in construction projects. The Bible also tells us that he had an interesting hobby. He had a hobby of engineering. He is credited with designing, inventing and testing certain weapons of war. He is credited with inventing multiple arrow launchers and various types of catapult. Major advances in their day. Remember, we're talking about the 8th century BCE with these events. And yet, brothers and sisters, none of those things were the love of his life. The love of his life was agriculture. He just adored livestock and farming, and he put in place irrigation systems that literally made the deserts blossom. Everything he did worked so well. Incidentally, his name Azariah means Jehovah has helped, and undoubtedly for decades of his rulership that was the case. However, we said that one event and his strength became a terrible weakness. Turn with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 26 and keep that chapter open. We're going to look at several verses in this chapter of the Bible. That's 2 Chronicles chapter 26. Now, before we read any of this particular chapter, there's just one thing that we need to help you with to avoid any confusion. And that is that one of the characters mentioned in this chapter of the Bible is the high priest, who by sheer coincidence has the same name as the king, the name Azariah. So in this particular chapter, the king is given his alternate name, probably the name that you and I know him better by, the name Uzziah, which interestingly means Jehovah is my strength. The Uz part of his name relates to the Hebrew word for strength, Oz. Now, we said that he was a great success. Just confirm that with one or two comments in key verses here. Take, for instance, verse 5. Look at the latter end of verse 5, and it tells us there that in the days of his searching for Jehovah, the true God made him prosperous, fulfilling his name Azariah, Jehovah has helped. Just jump down to verse 8, second half of verse 8. Eventually his fame went even as far as Egypt, for he displayed strength to an extraordinary degree, fulfilling his name Uzziah, Jehovah is my strength. And if you look at verse 15, and again the last sentence of that verse tells us, consequently his fame went out to a great distance, for he was helped wonderfully until he was strong. So have you got the picture, brothers and sisters and friends, that we've got a very, very strong leadership, strong rulership from someone that would appear to be a very strong spiritual person. But we said one event in his life and it changed. And that's mentioned in verse 16. However, as soon as he was strong, his heart became haughty, even to the point of causing ruin, so that he acted unfaithfully against Jehovah his God, and came into the temple of Jehovah to burn incense upon the altar of incense. So here, his strength, his success, now became a terrible weakness, and it led him into an act that was arrogant, presumptuous, and a manifestation of pride. His strength had become a weakness, and he offered incense in the holy of the temple. Now, we might ask the question, was that so bad to offer incense at the temple? Well, the only ones that were allowed to offer incense at the temple were not just those of the tribe of Levi, and the king, of course, was of the tribe of Judah, so a non-priestly tribe altogether. But actually, the only ones that offered incense were from one family line within the tribe of Levi, and that was of the sons of Aaron. Do you know how often it might have been that an Aaronic priest would have the privilege of offering incense at the temple? It may well have been only once in his lifetime. The king had so many privileges on offer to him, and yet here he was usurping a privilege that an Aaronic priest may only have got once in his lifetime. So what happened? Well, let's follow the account through and take verse 17. Immediately Azariah, the high priest, remember, and with him priests of Jehovah, 80 valiant men came in after him. Why 80? Well, it seems that was the total number of priests on duty at any given time. The high priest and 79 others. They all come in. And verse 18 tells us, then they stood up against Uzziah the king. Now that must have taken some courage, mustn't it? Remember, this king for decades, for nearly 40 years, has been undoubtedly a recipient of Jehovah's blessing. And yet here they are with the courage to stand up against the king. And they say this, it is not your business, O Uzziah, to burn incense to Jehovah, but it is the business of the priests, the sons of Aaron, the ones sanctified to burn incense. Go out from the sanctuary, for you have acted unfaithfully, and it is not for any glory to you on the part of Jehovah God. So there he is told that he's doing the wrong thing. What would happen? Would this strength that's become a weakness, would it revert back to being a strength? Would he have the strength of character, the latent spirituality to do the right thing, or would this weakness remain a terrible weakness? Well, verse 19 provides the answer. It said, but Uzziah became enraged, while in his hand there was a censer for burning incense, and during his rage against the priests, leprosy itself flashed up in his forehead before the priests in the house of Jehovah beside the altar of incense. There he is, his rage. And what suddenly happens? In the most humiliating of locations, where you couldn't hide it, out from the middle of his forehead, out pops this gnarled, rotten, pussy, smelly lump. Leprosy. So obvious to everyone. Verse 20 tells us, when Azariah the chief priest and all the priests turned toward him, why, there he was, stricken with leprosy in his forehead. So they excitedly began to remove him from there, and he himself also hastened to go out, because Jehovah had smitten him. He was never cured of his leprosy. He was restricted from the vast majority of kingly duties. They were taken over by his son. And when he died, he could not be buried in the royal cemetery, but merely a plot of land nearby. Who do you think should take to heart the lesson of King Azariah? Well, really, the lesson is not for ones newly associated in the Christian congregation. Ones who've been in the truth a few years probably haven't perhaps yet developed any particular strengths in the truth. If you think of King Azariah, he'd been in the truth for decades. He'd had marvellous privileges. So perhaps you and I that have perhaps been in the truth for many, many years Perhaps we've got privileges like being a pioneer or in full-time service, or brothers in the congregation with certain privileges. Perhaps this lesson is far more applicable to you and I than it would be to someone newly in the truth. Because if we've been in the truth many years, we might be taking our strength for granted. How could it happen? How could what Uzziah did happen? Well, it seems that the king rationalised. Now, to be honest, you and I rationalise every day of our life in one way or another. To rationalise is to have a particular goal. Perhaps you want to do something, go somewhere, see someone, and you know in your heart of hearts that the answer's no. But to rationalise is to try and find some line of reasoning that we think gives us license to do what we want, have what we want, be with who we want. We try to justify our course, and that's called rationalisation. How might it have happened with the king? Well, it may have gone something like this. I have Jehovah's blessing. For decades of my rulership, Jehovah has been the one that's guided and directed me because things have gone so well. My name Azariah, Jehovah's fulfilled. He's certainly been my helper. And my strength, my name Uzziah, he's been a strength for decades of my rulership. I really appreciate all Jehovah's done. I'd like to do more. And doesn't Jehovah say that we should reach out for privileges? Isn't that something Jehovah wants us to do? It is, isn't it? Yes. And one of the privileges I've always wanted would have been to have offered incense in the holy of the temple. And at the moment, my people, well, at the moment, although they're serving Jehovah, they're making sacrifices on the old high places within the land of Judah. They're not actually travelling down to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices. If I was to offer sacrifices at the temple and offer incense at the temple, wouldn't it send out a very strong signal that my people should come from the high places into Jerusalem to offer incense? In fact, this could be a whole new era of closer ties between the kingship and the priesthood. It's a load of rubbish, isn't it? But you see how easy it would be to rationalise. Could we do the same? Yes, we could do the same, unfortunately, ever so easily. Theocratic organisation. You probably don't know, brothers, but we get an awful lot of paperwork. I mean, we've got a wodge of paperwork on the Charities Commission. And of course the Society are very helpful. They send guidance notes with it as to how to handle it. I was just reviewing it myself just some time ago. What amazed me, though, is that there's certain shortcuts that society haven't spotted. If I take these shortcuts, produce my own computerised form, I'm going to save myself an awful lot of time that I can spend in the ministry. Easy to rationalise, isn't it? Rather than doing it the right way. What about circumventing theocratic order? I don't know if you've seen it, but that foyer, brothers, to be honest, it's a disgrace that foyer, isn't it? You know, and it was like that for the memorial. And it's not a big job, is it? Anybody could do it. Even I could do it. Yeah, even I could do it. If I went ahead and did it, I'd be doing the brothers a favour. And I'd be showing them up. Yeah, I think I'd just go ahead and do it. That would show them something, wouldn't it? Yes. Without consulting with the maintenance committee, who may have a reason why it's not done, who may have it assigned, who may have a refurbishment in mind, wouldn't it be easy for us to run ahead of theocratic order? Or what about trying to circumvent headship? Could that happen? At the end of our meeting, one of the younger members of the congregation is manifesting a degree too much enthusiasm. Yes, the child's running around the Kingdom Hall. So what do? Well, you grab the child. No, not round the throat. But obviously you grab the child because he could hurt himself by running in the Kingdom Hall, or he could knock over perhaps one of our older members and they could really be hurt. And then what do? Well, you give the child what it deserves, don't you? If only. No, it's not our place to discipline somebody else's child. So what you do is you take the child back to the parents, explain to them what the child has been doing, and then unfortunately get often let down that the parent doesn't really take it as seriously as you think it should be. But that's the parent's responsibility. Or what about counselling sisters whose husbands are baptised members of the congregation? Are we allowed to counsel a Christian sister without the permission or the presence of her husband? But it's only a little thing really, and she's only just there. And he's not very well tonight, so he hasn't come. And just while I remember it, I might as well just mention it to her. It would get it done ever so quickly. And it's such a little thing really. While I remember it, save time. Do we really think that we can get Jehovah's blessing by circumventing headship? You see, yes, it's easier for us, even in the truth, that we might rationalise. So do not let your strength become a weakness. It's important that we try to identify what our strengths are, because they could become a weakness. Let's give you an example or two. Do you, brothers and sisters, have a love of law and order? Do you? Well, if you do, that is a strength. After all, Jehovah is a God of law and a God of order. So that's a strength. But if we take it too far, how could it become a weakness? Well, we could take it too far and then begin becoming perhaps too rigid about certain laws, or perhaps rather sort of inventing more rules than are necessary within the Christian congregation. And we end up becoming a little bit pharisaical with lots of rules and regulations because we've got a love of law and order. Take another one. Do you have an interest in people? Do you like people? If you've got that as a strength, brothers and sisters, then you will be good in the ministry. Probably one of the most important qualities to have is an interest in people. People will sense that, and you will always get good calls, and you'll probably bring people into the truth. If you've got a love of people, if you're interested in people, that is a strength in the ministry. But you can probably guess how that could become a weakness. That we have too much of an interest in people and their private affairs, and then we become a busybody in other people's matters. And that's when our strength can become a weakness. Try another one. Are you quite an easygoing character? You're a person who doesn't take yourself too seriously. You can laugh at yourself. Well, I think we'd agree that they're strengths, aren't they? They're aspects of, if we can laugh at ourselves, if we don't take ourselves too seriously, somewhat easygoing, that in many ways is a strength. But it could become a weakness. Because if we don't take ourselves too seriously, could it be that we don't take other things too seriously either? That we're a little laid back regarding our responsibilities? And perhaps we don't get round to things that we ought to do spiritually. Or our punctuality at the Kingdom Hall isn't very good because we don't take seriously that we should be here in our seats at 7:30. And then, what one could say is a strength has become perhaps a weakness. We mentioned one earlier, albeit being steadfast, firm, reliable. Well, we said that was actually a strength that every single one of us should aim to develop. But go too far and that steadfastness can end up becoming stubbornness. An unwillingness to change. And if there's one thing we know about the truth, things are always changing. We're constantly going to have changes to book study groups. To make a new book study group, are we willing to change? Or do we dig our heels in and not willing to change book study group? A new type of ministry, alternative witnessing, new mapping of the territory. Do we live in the past because we're a bit stubborn? Or do we move forward with changes that are needed? Do you see how steadfastness could become the weakness of stubbornness? And you could probably think of a few more examples as well. Do we get the lesson? Do not let your strength become a weakness. Identify your strengths, brothers and sisters. You have them. And then make sure that they remain that. Remember we said earlier that we're far more likely to be spiritually sorely tried by a strength becoming a weakness than by our weaknesses. So it is worth identifying. Now, there are two other lessons we can learn from King Azariah. The first lesson is this. When did Jehovah act? Okay? What was his real sin? When was he condemned? Well, picture the scene. There's King Azariah in the palace. And he gets this idea of offering incense at the temple. We said he rationalises and he comes up with this idea. Well, when you and I come up with a bad idea, with something that's unscriptural, what do we do? Well, he didn't. He let the desire grow. And you can perhaps picture him going onto the palace balcony. Now, you may recall that Jerusalem was built on two hills. The palace, the seat of government, was on a hill called Mount Zion, and at the other end of Jerusalem, the temple was built on another mount or hill called Mount Moriah. And there, on the balcony, he can see the temple. And the idea continues to ferment. He then decides to go for a walk. You'll never guess where he ends up at. Oh, look, I'm at the temple. And he then goes a step further. He steps into the priestly courtyard. Now that was a sin. Up till then, he'd not technically done anything wrong. Wrong thoughts, but no actions. But by stepping into the courtyard of the priests, he is in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what does Jehovah do? Nothing. So he starts to walk across the courtyard. So far, so good. He then comes to the steps that lead up to the holy. Goes up the steps, and in between the two pillars, remember Jachin and Boaz, and he steps into the holy. Now that was a major sin. As we said earlier, an Aaronic priest may only get the privilege on one occasion of going into the holy. Even the high priest only went into the holy 3 times, and that was on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. And he stepped in to the holy. Now at that point, brothers and sisters, he should have been awed and humbled. The holy was a room probably about 3/4 of the width of this kingdom hall, and about 3/4 of the length. Down each side were tapestries, reliefs of cherubs. Now, as you know, the cherubs represented the upholding of Jehovah's sovereignty. He should have realised that he had stepped outside his authority and was no longer in subjection to Jehovah. That's what the cherub should have reminded him of. There were also the golden lampstands. Do you remember the ones with those 7 branches and the centre one? Little lamps on. And there were 10 lampstands, 5 on that side and 5 on that side, overlaid in gold. In front of each one of the lampstands was a table of showbread, overlaid with gold. Let's try and picture the scene. You've got these little lamps shining, the reflection coming off the gold of the tables towards the king. And at the end of the room was the altar of incense, overlaid with pure gold. And he started to walk the length of the holy. Every step a sin. And what did Jehovah do? Absolutely nothing. He got to the altar of incense. And he took up the incense. Now, the recipe for incense, the Israelites knew. It's there in the Bible. But for an Israelite to make up for himself, that recipe of incense was punishable by, yes, death. And here was this king, in the place he should never have been, misusing incense. And just one step ahead of him was the curtain leading to the most holy, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden cherubs, and what the Jews called the Shekinah light. He offers incense, and still Jehovah does nothing. Look back at verse 18 to see what happened next. It tells us that 80 priests cram into the holy. And they say to him in verse 18, "It is not your business, O Uzziah, to burn incense to Jehovah, but it is the business of the priests, the sons of Aaron, the ones sanctified to burn incense. Go out from the sanctuary, for you have acted unfaithfully, and it is not for any glory to you on the part of Jehovah God." He was told to go. And still, Jehovah's done nothing. He could have gone. Oh, there probably would have been some sanctions, there would have been some discipline, but he wouldn't have been struck with leprosy. He could, even at that point, have gone. So what is it that condemns him? Well, verse 19 tells us, "But Uzziah became enraged, while in his hand there was a censer for burning incense, and during his rage against the priests." There it is. In other words, it was his reaction to counsel that condemned him. When he received the counsel from the priests, his reaction to that counsel is what condemned him. And he then died a leper. In a sense, exactly the same procedure occurs in the Christian congregation today. For an individual, brothers and sisters, to get the humiliation of being disfellowshipped, they are not disfellowshipped for the sins along the way, many though they may have been. They are only disfellowshipped because of their reaction to counsel as being unrepentant. Brothers and sisters, never ever feel that somebody has been wrongly disfellowshipped. The shepherds of the congregation that are hearing that particular case are looking for genuine repentance. They want to find it. If they don't, they have to be man enough to disfellowship, because the person doesn't react, even during the hearing, to the counsel that they're given. So they get disfellowshipped. Even a marking talk. Now, you may well have never heard a marking talk. They are relatively rare, but a marking talk is given when a member of the congregation is engaged in what's called disorderly conduct. They're directly contravening Bible principles, but not actually sinning worthy of a judicial committee. And the elders provide counsel repeatedly, time and time and time again. But the person does not adhere to the counsel, does not change. And then the elders will give what's called a marking talk. Now, you'll know it's a marking talk. You won't ever mistake it, because the elders will turn up the scripture in 2 Thessalonians and say, this is a marking talk. Now, although the person's name isn't mentioned, if you or I know who it is that's following that disorderly conduct, then we are obliged to socially mark them. That means we still talk to them at the meetings. That means we still take them on the ministry. But no, they don't come back to tea breaks. We don't invite them to our barbecues. And they don't join us for football on a Sunday afternoon. Until they change. Or it could even be, in a very subtle way, for instance, the watch tower conductor. if he knows that you or I have not responded to counsel in a certain area, and yet we put our hand up for a specific paragraph in the Watchtower on that subject, do you think the Watchtower conductor in all conscience could take our hand? He's probably thinking to himself, any other paragraph, brother, but I'll take this brother's hand for this paragraph. It would be sad, wouldn't it? Turn to Proverbs 12. Because based on this lesson, this really is a strength that every single one of us should want to develop. That's Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 15. It's the second part of verse 15 really. But the lesson here is the one listening to counsel is wise. Now, I said there were two lessons from this little account from King Azariah. The second one is this. Do you recall how many individuals came in to counsel King Azariah? 80. Now, I don't know how many here tonight. Who's done the count for our meeting? How many here tonight, Ed? 71. So if we just like to drag another 9 people in off the street. But that's almost how many we've got. 71. Don't you think that having that many people to counsel him is a bit of overkill? A bit over the top, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I find it hard enough to take counsel from one person, let alone 71 or 80 people. So it's a bit hard, a bit over the top, a bit harsh. Well, let me ask you this. Whether it was or not, did it make any difference to the outcome for King Azariah? And the answer is no. It didn't. So whether it was over the top or not, his reaction to counsel still condemned him. Because sometimes in the Christian congregation, we get situations where individuals say things like this. Handle badly. Oh, yes. The elders handle it badly. Harsh. The way that mature spoke to that younger sister, ever so harsh. And those parents really quite blunt with their children. Oh yes, a bit over the top, harsh, heavy. Yes. It's done, not very done very kindly. But let me ask you this. If the person had never done anything wrong in the first place, then would they have put the elders, their parents, or other mature ones in the congregation in a position where they could have handled it badly? No, we don't want to handle things badly. We do want to handle things in a kind and loving but perhaps firm way. But let's not try to shift the spotlight, brothers and sisters. If you and I hadn't made the mistake in the first place, then nobody would have needed to have counselled us and been in a position where they could have handled it badly. All we're trying to do is shift the spotlight. Luke chapter 9. Do not let your strength become a weakness. If we can develop this particular strength, it won't become a weakness in Luke 9, and it goes a long way, brothers and sisters, in preserving our other strengths from ever becoming weaknesses either. That's Luke chapter 9 and verse 48, the last sentence. For he that conducts himself as a lesser one among all of you is the one that is great or